Good afternoon. This is an interview with Paul Gonson for the SEC Historical Society's Museum and Archive of the History of the U.S. Securities Markets and their Regulation. I'm Dan Gelzer. The date is July 16th, 2018, and we're in Springfield, Virginia. Let me start with a bit of background about Paul. For our viewers who might not be aware of it, Paul served on the staff of the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. for more than 37 years. During the last 20 of those years, he was, that is from 1979 to 98, he was the Commission's solicitor. Paul already has two oral histories in the museum, one from July 12, 2006, discussing the evolution of the law of insider trading, and one from February 23rd, 2011, talking about the SEC in the Supreme Court and some of his background more generally. So this will be Paul's third oral history, which might possibly be a record. I had the privilege of working with Paul at the SEC from 1974 to 1990, so I can testify personally to his central role in building the respect and credibility that the SEC enjoyed in the federal courts, and particularly the U.S. Supreme Court, over many, many years. He was also a mentor and an instructor to several generations, I'm sure many hundreds of SEC securities lawyers and other staff members. Paul joined the Washington office of Kirkpatrick and Lockhart, law firm here in Washington, in 1998, and his second oral history, the one from 2011, discusses some of his work in private practice. Moreover, in 1999, shortly after Paul left the SEC, David Reuter recruited him to help establish a new organization that came to be called the SEC Historical Society. So that's what we're here to discuss today. The Society is working on a project to construct a founders exhibit, that is a place in the virtual museum that will be dedicated to the men and women who worked to establish the SEC Historical Society. We're trying to create that as part of the 20th anniversary of the Society's birth, which we'll be marking next year. As one of the three primary founders, along with David Reuter and Harvey Pitt, Paul's recollections of the beginnings of the Historical Society will certainly be a key part of the exhibit. So the kinds of things that I'd like to touch on in my conversation with Paul today would include his recollections of the creation of the Society in its early days, some of the specific things he was involved in, and some of the challenges that the founders faced and how they met those. So we'll turn to those subjects, but Paul, thank you for being here, and let me ask first if there's anything you'd like to say at the beginning before we turn to the specifics.
Dan, thank you. I'm honored to speak to my role as one of the founders of the Society, and I am so pleased, Dan, that you are the interviewer. As you said, you and I worked together for many years at the SEC, and I have followed your career with admiration.
Well, thank you, Paul. As I tried to suggest in my introduction, you were certainly a major influence on my career and my development as a lawyer, as I know you were for many other people. So it's a treat and an honor for me to be able to interview you here today. Okay, Paul, let's start at the beginning. What do you remember about where the idea of the SEC Historical Society originally came from and how you first heard about it?
Well, late in 1998 or early in 1999, David Reuter asked me to work with him to establish a society that would do what you said. It would memorialize the SEC's role in the history of regulation and finance in the United States. He had spoken with SEC Chairman Arthur Lovett who was enthusiastic about this. I looked upon this not only as an opportunity to set up the society, but also to work with David Reuter. David Reuter was one of the preeminent academicians in the securities field in the United States. He was dean of the Northwestern University Law School and the author of some 30 published works on securities matters. A very, very knowledgeable man.
So I guess it's fair to say you were enthusiastic about the project.
Indeed,
You
yes,
didn't have to be
indeed
convinced.
I was.
What you touched on this a little already, but sort of what was the initial sort of vision of what the society would be, or what it would do?
Well, it's been said that there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And the founders of the society and its initial trustees, including you, Dan, embraced this idea and the question, well, why did they? And I think in part it was their desire to reflect credit on the SEC, from which almost all of them had come. And because of a vision, and I think there were different versions of this vision among different people, as to what might be accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Did you and the others discussing at the beginning see it as a bricks and mortar museum in the classic
I
sense?
did, and I think others did as well. I thought, as you said, it was going to be a bricks and mortar museum in Washington, D.C. And I had visited the Merrill Lynch Museum of the History of Finance in the World Trade Center in New York City. And this museum, the Merrill Lynch Museum, was closed to the public and could only be visited by an appointment with a Merrill Lynch staff member who would then act as a guide. The museum was very well done, and Merrill Lynch's contribution to it were featured, as certainly was understandable. So I came away thinking that we didn't have to have our own building. We could have a museum in an existing building. But I thought it should be open, unlike Merrill's museum. Either way, it would require a staff person from the SEC Historical Society there.
Well, maybe we'll
You know, also, maybe I should just add, if we're talking about vision, in my meeting with Chairman Levitt, he expressed the idea that this new society could be, as he said, a cheerleader on the Hill. That is somebody who we could be a lobbyist for the SEC. Nobody thought that was a good idea, and we all thought that the Historical Society should be, in fact, independent and appear to be independent, but that we should have a close relationship with the SEC.
Arthur Levitt would have been the chairman of the SEC at
That's
that
correct.
time, I think. Did you all have to sort of formally reject his idea, or you just went in a different direction without telling him?
We discussed it, but I think it was apparent that since our idea was to be an organization wholly independent of the SEC, although working with it, that to be seen on the Hill as a publicist for the SEC would run counter to that. So I don't think it took very much to finally reject that idea.
Yeah, it certainly would have been a much different organization if it had an advocacy role.
I'm going to pause you real quick as you answer that, just to get the two shot here. Okay, 5, 4.
Should I answer it again?
No, the answer was great. This is a good question.
All right. Well, let's bring the story forward. Kind of what happened next, and what was your role in the early forming of the society?
Well, as I said, David Reuter came to see me, and we talked about it, and he recruited me, if that's the right word, to be a helper for him in the society. I am under no illusions, and I think that one of the reasons he came to me was that I was available. That is, there are a lot of other people at the SEC I think have done a really good crackerjack job, but he knew, and Chairman Levitt knew, that I was about to leave. So I was somebody who could be available. And David and I liked each other. When he was chairman, we had worked together on many matters. As chairman, he was familiar with my appellate work in the courts. He had given me many projects to work on, some internal investigations to run. And one thing I do remember about him, for which I've been eternally grateful, he sent me to the Soviet Union. This was the era of sometimes called glasnost or perestroika. You may remember where the bitter relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States began to suffer, to soften a little bit. And I can remember still remember seeing on TV Soviet Chairman Gorbachev and SEC President Ronald Reagan walking together down Connecticut Avenue. So in that context, the U.S. Commerce Department organized a high-level business delegation to visit the Soviet Union around that time, right after that time. And what he did is he wanted to have the chairman of the business U.S. government agencies form this delegation. And he asked each of them, for whatever reason, I don't remember whether David did not want to go or he was not able to go, David asked me to go in his place. So there was the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, the assistant attorney general in charge of the antitrust division. They were the so-called anti-monopoly experts. There was the general counsel of the agriculture department. He was an expert on how food gets distributed to people, something that works very well in the United States, worked very poorly in the Soviet Union. And there were others as well. We formed this delegation, flew first class on Pan Am Airways, wonderful, and had, I thought, a wonderful time. It was hard work, but it was a great time. And subsequently, I may add, I went to the Soviet Union and then Russia on many occasions. And to further that, to help them develop a capital market to transfer from a command society to a market society, and also to organize a securities regulatory agency and the image of the SEC.
So there was some real impact coming out of those
yeah.
meetings then.
It really did. I was grateful to him for that.
Well, I think this may suggest a topic for a fourth oral history somewhere down the road. Maybe I should know, perhaps it's ironic too that we're discussing this on a day when our current president is
right.
Well, actually in Finland, meeting with the current head of Russia.
That is ironic.
But perhaps turning back to the Historical Society, did you look at any other organizations as a possible model? I mean, there's to some extent writing on a blank slate here in terms of the SEC, and I was wondering if there are models
we
to
did.
look
You know, we talked among ourselves as to how we should structure or organize this new society. So regarding the administrative structure of the society, I visited the White House Historical Association, but it became apparent to me that that would not be a good model for us, because that organization basically arranges tours of the White House. They take care of artifacts in the building, and they sell trinkets. So I also visited the D.C. Historical Society building, which is near DuPont Circle in Washington, and I was not impressed with that. I called the General Counsel of the Supreme Court Historical Society, who was a friend of mine. And I was an active member of that society, and I had attended many of its functions. As you noted, at the SEC, I was solicitor, and In that context, I had handled many cases before the Supreme Court and had argued 4 cases there. The Supreme Court Historical Society has functions in the courtroom, usually moderated by a justice, to which members, of course, are invited to attend, and I attended many of those. They also put out a scholarly publication. So I thought that it would be a good idea to model ourselves after that organization, and we did. My friend, the General Counsel of the Supreme Court Historical Society, was very helpful to us, made suggestions to us, gave us some documents, bylaws, and sort of things like that that we could model ours against.
Do they have the same sort of, I should say, independence from the Supreme Court?
They did,
that
yes.
the Historical
They were
Society has
absolutely independent from the court, but obviously they were very closely knit with the court, having their programs in the courthouse, in the courthouse of the Supreme Court building, and being usually moderated by a justice.
Well, let's talk about some of the other people involved. You certainly touched on David Reuter and to some extent Arthur Levitt. Were there others that were important in the early days of
Yes,
the
there
forming
were.
of the society?
1 second. Continue with yes, there were. Okay.
We went about establishing the first, what might be called the founding Board of Trustees, of which you, Dan, were
Yes,
a member, if I recall.
I was a member.
Yes, and we tried to select the highest quality persons that we could. Most of them were lawyers, and most of them were alums of the SEC, including former general counsels and former division directors and office heads. Most of them were based in Washington or in New York City, but there were some trustees from other cities as well, and it is to their credit that the out-of-towners attended most of our trustee meetings, which were usually held in the conference rooms of the law firms from which the DC trustees came. David, Harvey, and I anointed ourselves as leaders. David became chairman of the board, Harvey president, and I as secretary treasurer. When Harvey was appointed SEC chairman in the summer of 2001 by President Bush, I succeeded him as president. And when I stepped down about a year or so later, my recollection is that Ted Levine succeeded me as president. But these were very, very high quality people.
Yeah, I think Bob Kippers, I guess, was at Deloitte at the
Bob
time.
Kippers,
Was
I
also
think, was the only
involved.
non-lawyer
Yeah, I
on
think
the
that's
board.
probably right.
On the board. He was very, very good, and he became, as you know, very, very active thereafter. He was really a very prominent person.
Well, what were the early operations like? I mean, how did the work get done at the beginning?
Well, the work that was done by the three of us. There was David, Harvey, and I. We met in Harvey's conference room, and he provided the sandwiches and the goodies and the drinks.
I certainly remember some of those meetings in the Fried Frank conference room.
That's right. And the Fried Frank lawyers did all the work. They did the heavy lifting. So when we had to prepare certificate of incorporation as a nonprofit organization in Washington, they prepared that, and they prepared the application to the IRS for 501c3 status, which ultimately was granted. And they also provided an office for our brand new executive director that we hired then.
I would just note that Noah Berlin, who at some point in those days was a young associate at Fried Frank, is still the Society's general counsel, although he's on the PCOB's legal staff now. But
yeah.
he's,
Noah was a terrific
he's-
guy.
he-
He was in a
he
young
is.
lawyer, you're right.
Yeah.
Very, very good man.
Well, I was going to ask if there was a legal dimension. I mean, I guess you've mentioned incorporating and getting approval as a 501c3. Those, I suppose, would have been sort of the formal milestones.
Those were the formal things, but there was some other legal work as well. There were bylaws to be drafted and other documents. And the Freed Frank lawyers really did a terrific job. And of course, they did it gratis. They made no charge to us.
Well, then, speaking of getting the work done, at some point a decision was made to hire a full-time executive director, and I wonder what you remember about that decision and that process.
Well, we couldn't do everything ourselves, we realized, and as we had more and more ambitions, we realized we needed to have a professional person helping us. So, in my view, the best thing we did in the early days was to hire Carla Rosati as our executive director. She was and is a creative dynamo. We had advertised for an executive director, and we interviewed quite a few people. But Carla was the shining star, and there was no question that she was the one to be picked. And it worked out fine. I think that the history shows that she was a very fine choice.
So you were part of that selection
Yes,
process?
the three of us, Harvey, David, and I.
Yeah, well, I could just note that Carla, of course, retired from the Society about a year ago in March of 2017. But certainly a lot of what the Society is today is a tribute to her work. On the other hand, I think we're very fortunate to have Jane Cobb as
Yes,
her
she seems to be
successor.
terrific in the little bit of work I've done with her and things I've seen her accomplish.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning that Arthur Levitt saw the Society as potentially a sort of a cheerleader for the SEC, which didn't, I think for good reasons, pan out. But so what was the Society's relationship like with the SEC in those early days?
Well, it was very cordial. We decided, as I mentioned, that we would have no formal connection with the SEC, in fact, and in appearance, but we would nonetheless maintain a close relationship with it. Jack Katz, the SEC secretary at that time, was very helpful. He was an old friend, and I had worked with him extensively at the SEC. I met with him frequently at the SEC, and he came to quite a few of our meetings. And that was sort of the conduit by which we were establishing what I call a cordial relationship, but a hands-off relationship.
Maybe a little bit analogous to what you said about the Supreme Court Historical Society. The Commission, I think, has consistently let us have our annual meeting at the Commission, which is usually in the form of some sort of a program or discussion of
They've been
issue.
very, very good about it. And some of these meetings have been, I think, not only very good, but spectacular. And they're usually held on June 6th, which is the anniversary of the establishment of the SEC in the Securities Exchange Act in 1934 on January 6th. So that, in a way, we were taking over, if I could put it that way, the anniversary celebration, or jointly with the SEC. We would have it in the SEC building. We would have some programs that were, I thought, magnificent programs. And that was a good example of how we cooperated together, but were not co-opted by them.
Well, while we're talking about relationships with other organizations, let me ask you about a different one. There's, of course, also a group that I think you and I are both members of, ASICA, the Association of SEC Alumni, and sometimes people perhaps confuse the two or see some overlap between the two. What was the relationship with the SECA?
Well, we had a good relationship with the SECA. Of course, when we were starting out, they had been formed much earlier than we were. And when I was president, I had exploratory negotiations with the president of SECA about a possible merger. We thought that if we would merge, we could have some savings. We could have a single office instead of two offices. We could have a single executive director instead of two executive directors. But the idea foundered as we both came to realize that our differences were significant. The society, as I mentioned to you before, was at pains to let everyone know that we were not merely an SEC alumni organization. We were an organization, while we had a lot of SEC alumni, really were dedicated to establishing a museum for the history of financial regulation and finance in the United States. The SECA, on the other hand, was fiercely and proudly an alumni organization. The society was going to build a museum of some kind, while the SECA's chief, I guess, activity was to hold an annual dinner at which cash awards were generally given to SEC staff and other people who had written various kinds of articles that were then juried. And at that dinner, they would award the William O. Douglas Award, a sort of an alumni of the Year award to a highly respected alum. While William O. Douglas is remembered as best as a long-term Supreme Court justice, he was a very effective chairman of the SEC,
yes.
and the honor is named in his capacity as chairman. Also, our funding was different. The society relied on substantial contributions from members and non-members, organizations. The SECA obtained its funds mostly from its very large membership and profit, which it had annual dues, it still does, and from the profit from its annual award dinner, which attracted hundreds. I mean, I think it's now up to 700 or 800 people pay big bucks to attend that, and that's how they generate their funds.
At least to my recollection, SECA started out with something of an enforcement alumni focus. I think it was essentially a group of enforcement guys that enjoyed the idea of getting together.
Exactly right. They were the enforcement people, and then it sort of broadened out from that.
All right, well, I said at the beginning, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was hurdles and challenges and how they were overcome. I guess you've already touched on some things that might be regarded as challenges, but anything else you cite in that regard?
Well, maybe one thing which is, not particularly known because it never happened was we were worried that the acronym for the SEC's historical site, SECHS, might started to be called SEX, but it never was. So that never came to pass. Also,
I would say I have a lot of sympathy for that because when I was at the PCOB, we labored under being called the peekaboo because thought our acronym
I have to admit that I called it peekaboo too. A lot of people.
We didn't care for that.
Also, there were questions early on about how we were going to pay for everything, which we talked about how we were going to fund it.
Yeah, I would imagine that a rule really for any nonprofit, particularly as one starting funding, where the money is going to come from.
So we realized that fundraising would be an important and ongoing function. So Carla had done fundraising in her early position. She was very good at it. And she used to tell me, introduce me to the person or organization from which you want some money, and leave it to me, which expressed, I guess, a great amount of confidence. But that was well-placed confidence, because she always showed up back at the office with a contribution. So she was really very good at that. And then all the trustees were expected to make a significant gift each year and every year. And I have been making it every year up to including this year. The trustees successfully prevailed on their firms to make annual recurring contributions, and I would dare say that many, maybe most of the prominent law firms and accounting firms have made and are continuing to make substantial contributions every year. Some of the trustees, including myself and yourself, were members of the Federal Bar Association's Federal Securities Law Committee, and the FBA made annual $25,000 gifts for many years.
And that, just note that is, the support from the FBA is continuing. Now we provide some content for their magazine in return. We put articles about things in the virtual museum that might be of interest, particularly to Securities.
I did not know. That's very good.
Well, then I guess beginning to think about the museum itself, how was the initial collection developed, and how is it housed? And I think, as we discussed initially, the thought was as a sort of a traditional museum with a physical collection.
We encouraged everybody, by everybody I mean everybody, trustees, SEC staff, alums, strangers, to contribute documents to the society. And a flood of documents were contributed of all kinds, which would be very helpful, I think, to researchers. Where we were going to put all these documents became more and more a difficult issue as they started to accumulate. History Associates, which had transcribed oral history tapes for us, had a warehouse and an office building in Rockville. Carla considered that space as an alternative repository. That is temporary or permanent. We would take our documents to that warehouse as an alternative to creating our own repository or a partnership with the SEC or a local law school to house a repository. I taught at Georgetown Law School at that time as an adjunct professor, and I visited then Dean, Georgetown Law School Dean Judy Areen, and proposed the idea of having Georgetown be a repository. She was very courteous, but she did not want that at all. So we really had, at that point, really no place, no firm place to put all these documents.
But just before we go on, you just referred to the oral histories, and at least to my recollection, one of the core ideas of the society was to get oral histories from people who'd been involved in the history of the SEC while they were still available to be to give oral histories. What can you expand on that, or what do you recall about where the idea came from of oral histories and how that developed?
The founding trustee, Alan Levinson, did a marvelous job. He headed up the committee for oral histories for the society. And he recruited volunteers to be interviewers and selected the persons to be interviewed. These were mostly senior persons who were or had been at the SEC. There was a sense of urgency to get their oral histories while they were still alive. Generally, the interviewers knew the persons who they were interviewed, and he rejected the suggestion for professional interviewers or academicians. So that was really the start of very many oral histories, which I think are crucially important to the museum.
I just noticed in preparing to talk to you that first oral history was Milton Kroll, and that was taken on September 13th, 2001, 2 days after the 9/11 attack. But I'm sure we both remember Milton, who I guess would have been on the staff probably in the 40s and early 50s.
Yeah, Milton was a very, very early guy. He was, well, yes, I could, sort of reminisce about all the people that he worked with, and we took oral histories from all of them. But yes, he was a very early person. He was also a terrific lawyer and a very nice guy.
Very nice
I
guy.
worked with him a lot.
All right, well, you were talking about the problems, or attempting to address the problems of where to house a gallery. When did you first become aware of the idea of switching to the concept of a virtual museum,
Well,
online museum? And what was your reaction to that?
In my time, I remember very little discussion about what was to become a virtual museum. We had a lot of discussion about the bricks and mortar museum in a building, and we had some discussion, I guess, about what later would be called a virtual museum, but I specifically remember very little of that. Carla likes to say that she was the spark plug to create the virtual museum. And maybe she was, I really don't know. That would have come if it came after my time. I remember that we had some discussion about using the internet, but most of us thought it meant our website, and we believed that it was not as attractive as a museum, so that never really went anyplace.
Gets to be a little hard to remember how developed the internet was in 2001, but I suspect in that sense not that long ago, but it was still pretty primitive.
I think it was still pretty primitive, and I don't know, the feeling was, I guess, virtually unanimous that that would not work well. Now, maybe at a later time, as it did develop more fully, it might have, but at that time we sort of dismissed it.
Well, let me ask you about something else that I think would have been near or right at the end of the time that you were an officer, and it probably falls more under the heading of a challenge, given the way it turned out. But that was the 2001 Major Issues Conference, which was a conference that was kind of designed ambitiously to showcase the society and discuss, I think, current issues facing the SEC. What can you tell us about that conference and its background?
Well, unfortunately, because I guess largely because of the timing, as you said, right after September 11th, it was very poorly attended, and it ended up creating a very significant loss of, as I recall, about $100,000. That loss was bailed out for us by Northwestern University, where David Reuter had been a very high-ranking person for many years. So we decided that we would move on from that.
I guess one other thing about that. Do you remember the role that the SEC played in that conference? I mean, it seems to me that this it was something that was planned jointly with the SEC, a little bit of an exception to the society's
well,
more
we did,
formal
and
independence.
subsequently we had more major issues conferences with the SEC. Yes, we developed it together. They certainly weren't going to underwrite any of the dollars involved, and didn't, but they provided speakers, and maybe they provided meeting rooms, I'm not sure anymore. But these were generally held in hotel ballrooms or elsewhere. Around that time, Carla was asked to leave with this big dip in funds, but she adamantly refused to go, which in retrospect I think was a very good thing. In other words, she was going to be a loyal soldier and stay on and do what she could. We, meaning the society and the SEC, went on to put on more major issues conferences, which were successful, and I spoke at many of them. And I must say that part of the reason for the Major Issues Conference was to say, look at us, you know, we're grown up now, you know, we're an important organization, and I think that was helpful in doing that.
Well, yeah, as you say, the 9/11 attack, I think, really kind of knocked the legs out of the 2001 Major Issues Conference. I can remember traveling to New York at that time, and I think the Reagan Airport was closed for some considerable periods. You had to take the train. I mean, just traveling became more of an issue than it traditionally was, and I think that affected the conference.
Yeah, it was unfortunately a bad time.
The society did dig itself out of that.
Yeah, it did, and today I understand its finances are very good, and have been.
Well, just a couple of final things. Now that the society is coming up on its 20th anniversary, so what would you like people to remember about its founding, or take away from the fact that a historical society was created to memorialize the history of the SEC and Securities regulation?
Well, unquestionably, it's the virtual museum. I mean, that's the crown jewel of the society. And I think that as people, and I think Carla told me there were 1 million hits on her.
Yes, we've crossed the million hits threshold a year or two ago. Yeah.
Wow. When you think about that, you realize that lawyers and accountants and historians and scholars and ordinary people have been, you know, flocking to that museum to search out very interesting things there. So I think that that's probably the best thing that's happened that the society has done.
But this is more broadly, why do you think it's important to memorialize and study the history of financial services regulation?
Well, you know, children ask, where did I come from, Daddy? And I think it's good to know, as human nature, to know sort of where we all came from. We being not society members alone, but members of the public, and as I said, lawyers, accountants, historians, scholars. And to have the original museum provide such a terrific answer to that about where did we come from is very good in terms of not only the history of finance in the 20th century, but also the history of regulation of that finance. And that twofold thing is, I think, a wonderful thing to have.
That pretty much covers what I wanted to ask you about. Paul, thank you for sharing your memories and thoughts about the Society's founding. Thank you for the role that you played in creating the Society and laying the foundation for what it is today. And also, of course, thank you for your role in making the SEC the respected agency that it is. And then I guess on the final personal note, thank you for your role in my professional career. And for
yes, but also I want to thank you, Dan, for giving me this chance to talk about my role. I get a lot of glory from being known as a founder of this prestigious organization. But I know that this is reflected glory. I was there only for a few years at its founding, and my glory is merely a reflection of the good work that so many others did, including you, Dan, for almost this 20-year history. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Paul.